Okay, so we should be live now. Hi, everybody. This is the second Ideologues debate. We have Liberaven and Mirswalda here to represent liberalism and integralism, respectively. So we're going to start off on the topic of secularism. So to begin with, Liberaven, could you give your opening statement on secularism?
Okay, so of course, secularism is a pretty key part of the liberal philosophy of how we should be governing ourselves. Each individual has a particular view of religion and their own set of beliefs. And the job of the state, in the liberal view, is not to push one particular view upon people and then mold them by force, but rather allow people to exercise their freedom to have the moral and ethical system that they choose to have or that they have grown up with. A big issue that also crops up when you have lots of people with different views in terms of religion specifically, when it's so integral to people's worldview of how the world is structured, is that there can be an extreme amount of tension between people. Now, some people will be tempted to say, well, why don't we then just make everyone have the same religion? But that's not really how belief works. If you force actions and beliefs upon people, then unfortunately you will get backlash. The best way to deal with the varying views of society is to allow them the freedom to exchange these views and to practice the um, the, the rituals and the beliefs that they have for themselves, rather than trying to mold people to one particular view. This will allow people to live the life that they freely think that they will have the best outcomes for themselves. If you have a situation in which people are not allowed to do that, then they're going to be running up against a wall in which they will not be able to live in terms of what is best for themselves. If you allow people to actually freely choose the way that they engage with religion, for example, you can have one church on one end of the street and then a mosque on the other end of the street, you will allow people to actually live according to their own personal way of life, and ultimately that's what the state should be doing for people. If we actually truly care about a society in which people can live as they see fit, then it would be apt to allow them to do so, and to have a framework in which we actually allow people to live out those things, whilst also legislating the various disagreements between people by the actions that they impress upon each other. This goes back to the age-old liberal idea of being allowed to do as you see fit for yourself, having the freedom to do what you want to do for yourself without infringing upon the freedoms of others. That is what leads to a healthy society, and that is what leads to a healthy way of going about one's own personal individual life as well. Basically, let's all just get along, essentially.
Okay, so Mirswalda, are you ready to give your opening statement?
Yep, mine's probably not quite as long, but I'll plow ahead
Sorry,
anyway.
I rambled there.
No worries at all. So for me, I think for my view of secularism is that I've always thought it's rather absurd to disprivilege at least one's own cultural texture. Christianity is a slightly peculiar religion in the sort of wider global context, or at least in the sort of non-monotheistic world. But I mean, obviously, other countries have a similar relationship to religion if they live near the Islamic world. But nonetheless, most religions and the form of religion which takes place amongst that local area emerges relatively organically from that people. And it's normally, and I say, I go back to Christianity being a slight outlier in this, but normally religions emerge on the basis of ancestral heritage in relation to their natural world around them. So an example of this probably is, well, an example of this being applied is modern historians will often talk about the Mongols being quite culturally or religiously tolerant, when they weren't necessarily religiously tolerant. They just didn't believe that the various spirits of the steppe were in any way applicable to the people of Baghdad that they just sort of sacked. So religion in many ways forms like a large basis of a society's cultural texture, even for sort of quote unquote secular people. You've got your in the Western world, let's go with examples we're familiar with, sort of Christmas, Easter, and we've commercialized those festivals. Those festivals are not only just Christian, they're also pre-Christian, and these are sort of perennial seasonal markers. And what secularism is basically doing, in many ways, in my opinion, is it's stripping away the spiritual and sort of transcendental from people's sort of ordinary lives. The left is rather bizarre in its secularism, in the sense that it's sort of basically, because, and I think this is largely the fault of Protestants in many ways, but because Protestants have basically tied their faith so strongly to the metaphysical existence of God and deliverance, that the moment that any kind of sort of scientific theory undermines that in any way, shape, or form, or like Enlightenment thinkers begin pressing against the metaphysical reality of God and a certain element of spirituality, that it's allowed the entire religious structure to sort of be, presently almost sort of abandoned, but at least, certainly, as I said at the start, disprivileged. Part of Northern Europe is slightly bizarre, since they have sort of state churches in the way that other parts of the world don't have. But in my opinion, all societies need a driving belief. They need something that sort of comes out of their past and pushes them not only forwards, but sort of force them to look upwards as well, and creates for them like an extra dimension. Church is important, not just because you sort of go to this building in your sort of civic centre, more or less, and just sort of sit there for an hour or so and listen to speak. And that's one of the mistakes of Protestantism, to sort of remove a sort of spiritual element to their religion in the way that the church functions. Because in most Protestant churches, it's sort of relatively unadorned. Someone gets up, they sort of speak for a bit. There's no theatre to it. There's no, ritualistic aspect to it. They've done away with incense and robes and everything. And for me, it's about providing something in society which is not your day-to-day warp and weft of life. It's a spiritual experience. It's something which connects you to your ancestors. It connects you to nature. It connects you to the spirit of your civilization, the people that made your civilization. Secularism, basically, in my opinion, although it's often framed as a sort of toleration issue, and many people do, I'm sure, are genuinely concerned with not wanting to discriminate against other religions and so on. It does in many ways, for the large part of society, it helps create what I would call a spiritual desert. And that's my opening statement for you.
Okay, so now we're going to go into opening discussion, or open discussion for 23 minutes. I'll start the timer now. So you can respond to each other's opening statements or make new points or anything is on the table.
Okay. Do you mind if I dig into some of the stuff you said?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, from what you've said, I really don't see any need for any political infringement of a particular religion upon people to have all of the things that you're talking about. I mean, a church is not a civic body, yet it still can absolutely provide people with all the spiritual guidance and the sense of community, and indeed the theatre that you're looking for. It's just different denominations and different religions will have different ways of doing this. And surely, if our goal is to allow people to have this spiritual guidance and allow institutions to enrich their lives, surely we should do it rather than a one-size-fits-all situation. We should allow various different religions to be able to supply people with what they specifically need for them. And that is actually how you avoid having a spiritual desert. It's by filling it with many different religions, ones that people freely choose. I mean, like, you say that Protestant churches don't have all the theatre and ritualistic thing, but like some do have some elements of it. Some have less. You know, I grew up going to an Anglican church, and we had a choir, we had robes, we had incense.
Oh yeah, I mean, like high
yeah,
Anglicanism is.
and I have friends.
Anglicanism is slightly more Catholic than it is Protestant.
Indeed,
in form.
And I have friends that are like part of the charismatic church, and that they have sort of electric guitars and things. And
Bless them.
I know, not the thing is, it is not my dig, but I know that I have friends that really find deep, meaningful spiritual connection and community through those churches. And why would I deny them that if they don't get the same connection that they do from a more sort of high Anglican or Catholic tradition? Why can't we have a pluralism of religion within society so that each and every person can get what they need for themselves?
So I think for me, this is an issue of whether it's like or not, in the sort of like German use of the word, of sort of being organic, like organically sort of emerging from something. And this goes back to, you know, obviously, you know, in my opinion, Islam has no place in the Western world, not because I disagree with it on a moral or ethic basis. I don't care at all. But it's like it was that as a religion for that part of the world in both a geographic and an ethnic sense. It belongs to those people who've cultivated it for hundreds of years within their own society. They've come up with their own customs for it. The diverse celebrations fit their part of the world. So you know, I believe that largely religions belong to a people or a people's, you know, Roman Catholicism and the various sort of high, you know, high Lutheranism or high Anglicanism. Those have, you know, emerged in our part of the world. They embody many of our traditions, many of which are pre-Christian, much to the sort of chagrin of various sort of fundamentalist Protestants. But my view, in the sense of against the pluralism, is that it's, you know, I do believe in these sort of cultural experiences, and in many ways, religion is a cultural experience fundamentally, which is why I'm opposed to secularism, because it denies a large part of a sort of national culture if you allow it to become too rampant.
I think you've got it completely the wrong way around. Secularism is about allowing the organic development of culture and religion. It's allowing people to actually engage with their culture in their communities at their particular place of worship. And what you're suggesting is, rather than having a system in which we allow that to happen, actually infringing upon people a certain set of political, of religious practices through political action. And that completely denies the organic nature. That's actually a man-made structure forcing religion. Surely there's an utter hypocrisy in the argument there.
Not totally, because I do view religion as a man-made construct, and unlike most Christians, I won't seek to deny that. The whole point is that it's our relationship with the natural world. So yeah, I mean, like it is a natural construct. I mean, as for it being politically enforced, I feel like it depends how you want to go about it being politically enforced. But you know, and obviously at the moment, I'm not necessarily interested in sort of waging war against various different denominations of Christians, or any sort of, you know, intersect conflict. But for me, I mean, my main issue is the sense of it being organic to people, and obviously this is where we're going to sort of cross borders into other topics such as immigration, as to whether, you know, why other religions are here in the first place.
Yeah, well, clearly, immigration will bring various different practices, but the point is that we are not one people that has one particular religion, but we are and have been for hundreds of years, if you take in the account of Protestants and Catholics, and even going further back before we were Christian, we have always had an element of religious pluralism, bar maybe a sort of 500-year stretch where there was mostly Catholicism. I mean, like, this is not like one homogenous nation with one religion. That's just a complete falsehood.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I
If we
agree with
truly
that.
want to, if we truly want to embody what it means to be, I mean, in our case, British, then it's about embracing all of the people that are in this country and allowing all of the people to engage with their particular communities and to have the kind of spiritual journeys that they want, and are part of their particular culture. Culture isn't something that is like completely homogenous across a whole nation. We certainly have many things in common, but there are also smaller communities. Like people in northern towns won't share everything in common with people from southern towns, and same for one particular church and another particular church, and same for a church and a mosque. There are lots of different variations in the cultural practices within this country, and we should be able to allow people to engage with those rather than shutting them off, because it's part of the fabric of the nation.
I mean, I don't agree that sort of mosques and so on are part of the fabric of the nation. I mean, obviously they are in a literal sense of existing presently in our society. They are part of the fabric, but they're not. The Islam is not a religion developed in our part of the world, and it has no, even in its sort of quote unquote modern development, is alien to our part of the world. So it's not a, and yeah, and there is an extent to which obviously if a large swathe of people move to different parts of the world, they take their religion with them. But the issue of immigration is a separate debate.
I don't think your argument quite makes sense, because Christianity also didn't originate in Britain either.
So we can come on to that in a way. And we're talking slightly about. I mean, we're talking about this just before we went live, actually. In a sense that I sort of tend not to particularly subscribe to sort of Christian ethics in a way. I probably have more in common with what the like Norse and Romans and stuff thought about the spiritual world.
Okay.
In that sense.
So you'd enforce paganism?
No. I mean, I am a Roman Catholic, but what I believe is that it's been so long that the Catholic Church or Christianity in general has provided a huge part of the cultural texture and landscape of what's now Western civilization. And it could be that in however many years' time that Islam takes up that mantle, but I'll be dead by then. Not that I'm dismissing that as unimportant, and that's not a bad or a good thing. But that would just be like a struggle in future generations that they'll have to deal with. But it's I mean, yes, Christianity is an important religion, but it's become, having come to Europe, it became a European religion in the way that it's seen globally now. Obviously, you've got sects in Africa and so on, and in most cases, those churches take on the flavour of the people there.
Indeed,
but the Christianity the Christianity that we understand in our own part of the world is organic to us.
Yeah, and the various sects within the UK of different religions will be particular to those particular communities, and the cultural practices that we have in general within this country will have an impact on such religions, and we will learn things from their culture, and that's fine. That's a good thing. Our culture is not something that's ever been static. We've always had influences from Scandinavia, from Germany, from the Romans before, and from the French even.
But the problem with that is,
we've always had a changing culture, and so why would we stop the clock and go with what you particularly want our religious cultures to be?
So the issue there is that and this is often the point made, is that people talk about immigration or sort of cultural cross-pollination in that sort of early migration period of the post-Roman Empire, is that all those groups, apart from the Romans, whose genetic footprint isn't actually particularly huge in Britain, and even a lot of their cultural footprint isn't particularly large either, is all those groups talk about, Celts and Norse, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, whatever, Normans even. They all came from that sort of same crescent of northwestern Europe, and they all those are different material cultural iterations of more or less the same ethnic group. You can certainly clump Normans, Vikings, and Anglo-Saxons.
Not
within the
Romans
same-
though, and
No, by
and
sort
Franks
of,
are slightly different as well, and
but
Celts as well, and
No,
also
but I-
Christianity has a lot of influence from the Jewish world as well, who also had
hang on, so-
influences from Persia. Like you can't just simply essentialize it to like one particular imagined ethnic group.
well, it's not a singular ethnic group, but what you have is that it's
It's
it
arbitrary,
is
at least.
it is slightly disingenuous to not create a spectrum between a Celt, a Viking, and a Bangladeshi or something. There's
course.
obviously a spectrum between it.
Geographic proximity means that the cultural exchange is going to be greater with people who are closer together. It's just now in a more globalized world, people can move from one side of the world to the other with far greater ease, and so the cultural exchange has just been more. I don't see where you can say that's a bad thing just because in the past travel's been harder.
But it's not just about travel, because it's about those, at the end of the day, like the rapid technological advancements in the last, say, 100 years, which made this more sort of easy, is unprecedented in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so obviously, like, that cultural shock is immense when you think about it.
Oh yeah, of course. I agree with that, of course.
Obviously,
yeah,
there's been hundreds of years of obviously the main groups which settled in Britain, and we can sort of distill them down to sort of Celto-Germanic. The Romans are a slightly different matter, but as I said, they're genetic, and B, their cultural influence on Britain is, well, minimal at first. The Romans obviously then come in later with the Normans, in the sense that they sort of re-bring that kind of Rome-based civilization back, but nonetheless,
but even the
Normans
had like Viking influences as well.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. But
So,
that's what I mean. But like, that's what I mean is that
it's all
most
so
of the group
fluid.
settled in, but for thousands of years, 4,000 years ago, the Yamnaya culture arrived in what's now Europe. They emerged from the steppes of Western Eurasia. They come from the sort of Caucasus Mountains. They have these sort of large herds, and they come into Europe. And the sort of most archaeologists would largely agree that the Yamnaya culture, these sort of Indo-European peoples, half of whom went into Northern India, the rest came into Europe, they basically genocided the people that lived here, these sort of Neolithic peoples. The Yamnaya had large herds of horses, cattle, sheep, crucially, of course, the horse. They came in with superior weaponry, and there was very little cultural pollination. They just massacred and genocided them, as the genetic and DNA record would suggest. There's a fair element of the matrilineal genetic line within our ancestry of these Neolithic peoples, but the male line is more or less non-existent.
So to stop that, why don't we have a system in which we actually have free cultural exchange rather than trying to impress one against others, possibly through the use of force? Surely that's better.
Well, I think that would imply, well, that's basically a learnt thing. If you think that's basically, if you think that humans can eventually learn to behave in that way, then perhaps you have a point. But I don't think.
What are you talking about? Humans for thousands and thousands of years have been able to peacefully trade and coexist with each other.
Oh, of course they can, but normally when two radically different groups blunder into each other, and granted, in a non-globalized world, it often was literally blundering into each other in some cases. There's always been violence.
There's not always there hasn't.
If you look at the Shetland,
there's often been violence.
Shetland Islands were sort of basically genocided by the Norse.
Yeah,
there's very little.
Violence has been a key part of human history for thousands of years, but also coexistence and trade have been a huge part of how humans have been able to have flourishing civilizations.
Yes, no, and granted, and certain parts of the world which sit at those crossing points have had these sort of cosmopolitan environments, but they are also quite alienated to the rest of their civilization, and often they ultimately fail. Bronze Age collapse is obviously, most modern historians don't tend to put too much emphasis on it for obvious reasons, but there is a compelling narrative within the Bronze Age collapse that many of these sort of civilizations, which are very cosmopolitan and diverse, relied on a huge trade network. They collapsed because there was a sort of, I suppose, a faltering sense of self. They relied hugely on these sort of vast slave networks. They sort of captured slaves who weren't particularly loyal to their city states, and
Sure, but
when the sea
I don't
peoples
see
arrived,
this as a valid argument, because you can say the exact same for any civilization. Like you were saying before we started recording, that you have a secular view of history, and I think that is right to some extent. Like, places rise and fall, no matter whether they're cosmopolitan or they're ethnically homogenous. We often have empires rising and falling, kingdoms rising and falling, civilizations rising and falling. That's just how human history has gone. But now we have a situation in which, at the moment, and it won't last forever, but at the moment, we have flourishing in many parts of the world, and a lot of that has been down to these secular societies. That might change in the future, but it's undeniable that that's also the flip side of it. You can't just essentialize it to one side of this debate.
I think the sort of successes of these secular societies is sort of very material, which obviously is a huge part of it. And you can that some of their zenith has been under sort of secular rule. Perhaps best example might be France, perhaps. Sort of, you could argue like laicite. But even then, even with France's secularism, up until probably quite recently, you very much argue that the average Frenchman in his village was very much Catholic. And if you probably asked him what it meant to be French, being Catholic would probably be one of his sort of identification markers.
Yet it was secular. So how does that help your argument? Surely that helps my argument that religion can flourish, culture can flourish in a secular environment. But you can do that and even have the majority. If that's the case, you can have the majority follow one particular religion, identify strongly with it, but also not push out others who have other beliefs and other practices, who can live fantastic, great lives in that same nation.
I think France is a particularly sort of unique example that I sort of pulled out there, but in most cases, I think I go back to sort of West and East dichotomy in this, is that let's go to say like Japan, for example. There are many Japanese people who are what we might perhaps call atheists, but are still also culturally Shintoist.
Good for them.
And so, but in many parts of the world, our relationship with our religion is slightly bizarre, because we either believe in God and therefore we go to church, we put up like a nativity scene, and we do sort of X, Y, Z with our religion, or we're not at all, and we sort of reject it, and you could even be quite sort of militantly against it.
I think this is patently false in terms of Britain. I think that there are hordes of people who engage with Christian festivals but don't necessarily believe in God, or they have a sort of agnostic belief in God, at least. Like, that's been my experience, and that's been the experience of a lot of people that I've known, at least. It may be anecdotal, but it seems to be the case that churches are packed during Christmas time and Easter time, but then see very few people during the rest of the year. And that's because there are some people that are very devout in their beliefs, and they practice it through the church on a full-time basis. There are some people that believe, but they go to church, every now and then at particular festivals. And there are some people who don't believe, but it's part of their culture to take their kids to the Christingle service.
Oh I do agree with that completely. That's my experience as well. What I mean is that people either buy into Christianity in a serious way, or not at all. In the sense that,
but how does that statement line up with what I just said?
Well, what I mean is that many people either call themselves Christian or not Christian.
All right, we do have 2 minutes left, so but.
All right, okay, I'll try and wrap up then. Whereas people might, for example, in India, call themselves or identify as a Hindu, but not necessarily be believe that Ganesh is an elephant head or something.
Yeah, well,
But
I think there's plenty
I
of
do.
Christians that identify as Christian because that's how they're brought up, but they don't believe everything. I think that's a pretty common experience for a lot of people in this country.
I know. I think there is to some extent in our society there is quite a good degree of cultural Christianity in some ways.
And I think all of them should be able to live that life that they want and engage with as much or as little of any religion as they see fit, as what suits their own life. Because ultimately, the goal of a society is to make sure that everyone lives the best life that they can.
I disagree with the statement that that's the role of society in many ways. But obviously, my
The
issue
organisation of it, at least,
with sort of secularism in this sense is that by disprivileging the main religion of a people in favour of others, you are allowing that religion to perhaps be corroded. You're denying its place of sort of supremacy within a society.
Secularism rejects disprivilege. Secularism is not about disprivileging whatsoever.
But it disprivileges by nature if it allows
secularism,
other religions.
Secularism is about not privileging. It's the absence of privileging. It's not holding up civically any religion above another. It's about not enforcing by force any particular religion. It's not privileging whatsoever, nor is it disprivileging.
But by nature of not privileging the religion that has more or less naturally emerged from a people and has been part of their sort of cultural
Secularism is all about natural emergence. Secularism is not privileging anything and allowing people to naturally go about their lives and for religions to naturally evolve and change.
But
that's the whole point.
That is time. Now we're going to move into closing statements. So first, you can give your closing statement, Mirswalda, which can also be a response.
Okay, so I'll sort of respond to that briefly in my sort of closing statement. And I'll go back perhaps in time in Europe to pre-Christian Europe, and in many of the Indo-European traditions, the king was also the sort of the chief priest. You have this office in Rome. You have this with the Irish kings, and in the Norse sagas, it refers to many of the sort of tribal kings and leaders as officiating many of the rites of the tribe. And there were obviously other priests. You had the Druid caste in the Celtic world, and in many ways, some of the best existing literature regarding Indo-European traditions actually exists best in India in the Vedic texts. But in the European tradition, spirituality is inseparable from its governance. You sort of read out the various sort of haruspexes of the animal entrails before going to war or making a decision. It's so closely bound up with as a society that the beliefs which emerge from our ancestry and nature around us, our religion being the Catholic Church, be it the sort of Norse paganism. Oh, sorry. I'll just wrap up quickly.
Just finish up whatever you were saying.
Yeah, no worries. Essentially, these things are sort of, I more or less view that religion and statecraft are bound together through a mixture of tradition. And obviously, spiritualism is all around us in the world, and I see no reason why it should be disprivileged from the state.
All right, so Liberaven, now you can have your closing statement / response.
Yeah, I just think that ultimately secularism is about providing the framework for the maximal religious utility, I guess. If people have varying religious practices that are best suited for them, then if we are looking at how to best accommodate religious practice and culture within our society and truly have something that is free and emerging and natural, then the best way to do that would be to provide this framework wherein we allow people to practice the religions that they want for themselves, engage with the communities that they want, engage with the certain rites and practices of their particular religions, and do so in a way in which we are all harmoniously allowed to practice those individually and as communities. I think there's not much more to say on that. So secularism seems to be the best way to go.
All right then. So from here we're going to move on to traditionalism. So you each give. So first, Liberaven, your opening statement on or Mirswalda, your opening statement on traditionalism.
My visit. Okay, I can go first. So for me, traditionalism is essentially applying the knowledge of our ancestors to, our sort of quote unquote modern world as such. There's the old quote about it, not being preservation of ashes, but keeping a flame alight. I'm along with being an integralist, I'm a perennialist. So I believe that sort of certain truths, whether they sort of be emotional, physical, spiritual, or whatever, that those ring true through like down the ages, basically. And for me, like, a lot of part of that sort of comes out of a romantic notion of the European warrior hero. You got your sort of your Beowulf, your Siegfried, your Achilles, and that there was a golden age in European civilization, whether or not it sort of actually metaphysically existed. That a lot of our ideals emerge from this quote unquote period that's embodied when Beowulf is king of the people we now call the Swedes, when the Trojan Wars are occurring, which, I mean, some of these events we know to be sort of quasi-factual, but exist in a sort of mythological sphere with all sorts of monsters going on. And that basically is the golden point of our civilization. And we've kind of melted away since that. And we sort of degenerated. I mean, we've had obviously these sort of great empires and everything, but they've sort of come away from this single point. But why is this sort of important to us as we exist now? It's
so that is time, but just finish up.
Okay, yeah, I'll up again. It's basically like, for me, it's the texture of a civilization. It's the texture of life. It's what makes you distinct from other people. If you've got a church, a big Gothic cathedral as opposed to a big pagoda in China or Japan or wherever. But so, I'll wrap up now and I'll hand this over to Liberaven.
All right, so Liberaven, your opening statement.
Okay, I mean, along the similar lines of what I've been saying about secularism, I don't think it's for the state to enforce any particular traditions upon people. Like, I understand all the things that you're saying, and you can have this deep feeling about certain traditions and the texture of society, and you personally prefer society back on X date. I know a lot of people with similar views to you have their own personal date that they like, whether it's like the 1880s or the 1500s or the before 1000 AD. But these are all, I guess, different feelings, and that's fine and good. And probably the most important thing about life is feeling. What's important from an organizational standpoint is to make sure that people's lives are accommodated and not infringed upon, rather than have a government come in and say, sorry, I don't like your traditions, you need to follow the traditions of what this person thinks over here. I think is completely wrong and against the whole point of the various feelings that you seem to be expressing here. I think it's surely the aim of any government should be to accommodate people and allow them to engage with their own cultural practices
that is time,
in a way that expresses their own personal desires. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so now we're going into opening discussion, or open discussion. So 23 minutes.
Okay, right. So I'll sort of begin with this, as I think again, and this sort of ties in with the religious debate actually, so it's sort of quite a nice segue to go into. But again, like religion, and in many ways, religion often informs traditions, or indeed vice versa. But it's about it to like emerge organically. So when other groups arrive, when other traditions emerge within your society, you go, well, where's that come from? Why are they here? And to what extent are we going to? Well, I mean, like, how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to sort of send them home? Are you going to tolerate them and perhaps allow them to sort of overtake you in many ways? So I think that's the question for the liberal issue. Obviously, you were saying that the government shouldn't be sort of imposing traditions on people, but in my opinion, these traditions exist. The government is elected from a people, and it's just enforcing those traditions and way of life that has emerged. And if other people arrive within your society, then I don't really think they should be here at all anyway, and they shouldn't be let in. But having found their way here, or if there's an invasion or whatever, or we should import migrant workers, that if you arrive in a different part of the world, then it's not there's instances which like you should conform to that part of the world if you happen to be there.
I'm sorry, but I've got to say that I'm absolutely dumbfounded about the argument here, because you're telling me that you are not wanting the government to enforce things and you want things to be emergent, which is exactly what I'm saying, and then you say a sentence later, therefore we should look at what's come naturally and then enforce it.
No, I wasn't saying it shouldn't be enforced.
It does not make sense to me, the fact that you seem to be saying that sort of things naturally evolving and emerging is what you care about.
No, hang on. I think
you won't allow that to happen.
I think you want to. I wasn't saying the government shouldn't enforce things. I'm just saying that the government, in a traditional sense, I'm not saying the government should. All I'm saying is the government shouldn't or wouldn't need to impose its traditions on people, because in a sense of other people, I think what you're referring to is that in a quote-unquote pluralistic society of people who've come from different parts of the globe, and they will carry their own traditions with them. What I'm saying is that traditions emerge in a society, and obviously there'll be a spectrum of different cultures even within a fairly homogenous nation. But what I'm saying, obviously, if you have large degrees of immigrants and the government is enforcing traditions on them, then obviously that is problematic. But the issue there, it doesn't lie with the government being authoritarian about its culture. It lies in the existence of those people there in the first place.
The issue you're going to run into, though, is being able to justify the use of force to I guess you'd probably say that you need to get rid of them in order to actually have this true emergent traditional Britain. You'd have to find a way to justify exactly who goes and on which cultural grounds. And that then leads into an even bigger problem, which is exactly how you define what the traditions of this country actually are, other than what your own personal beliefs are, because every single person is going to have a different idea about what our cultural practices are and what our traditions are. Sure, there's going to be lots of overlap, but surely we should just allow that overlap to emerge into the things that people actually freely act themselves, rather than using the levers of power to enforce what whoever's in power decides is what the traditions of this country should be.
But it's largely a matter of enforcing. At the end of the day, immigration is in itself, a government, policy in a way, because people don't just rock up on our shores. They don't just come here in a sort of, well, some people do illegally, but most people don't come here, in a dinghy. They have been let in by legislation, which in the 60s, 70s, or even late 50s, said that they could come here. So it's it's a government problem in the first place, and it's if we're going to create an environment where you are, allowing a cultural malaise to appear, you've got to get your sort of dustpan and brush out and start thinking about how you're going to go about this, and just sort of allowing this sort of multicultural mess to appear. I'm an ethno-nationalist, so I would more or less say that if I was given the magic wand tomorrow, I would deport the overwhelming majority of the non sort of northwestern European population of Great Britain for the most part. But if I was to be purely civic in my nationalism and say, well, so long as they learned English to a good extent and were well versed in our sort of cultural norms, there's still a huge task to be overcome there. Do we really want large swathes of Britain, due to unrestricted migration, more or less. It's not unrestricted at the moment, but open migration, open door policy. Whole parts and swathes of this country to no longer be recognisable to our ancestors in an organic way. Obviously,
but that's always been the case. Society's always evolved.
But there's an extent to which they evolve, and to which point they bifurcate for each other.
Many of the traditions that you will think are part of this country are creations of the last 100, 200, 300, 400 years. But our ancestors would have seen those and then be like, this isn't recognizable. Of course it's not, because things change, and that's fine. What we should be doing is allowing things to change in a way that is free and natural according to our nation. As you say, why would I allow the government to take a hand and have any kind of policy which is trying to mold like what kind of cultural practices that we have? Surely it should be just enforcing the rule of law and having all of the civic things in place, but then allowing us to naturally evolve our culture into what it's going to be. And having different peoples here has always been the case, and will continue to be the case, and should be the case if we want to come into contact with different cultural practices, which we can take on in part, and then of course the other part is freely as a society, not a government, also reject things that we do not think should be part of our society. And that's all about free association. The liberal vision is that if you are in a place where there are people who do not share your values, you have the absolute right to not associate with them. You shouldn't be forced to, be engaging in any actions with them. We, on a daily basis, well, hopefully not on a daily basis, but at some points in our life, we will have people that may have been our friends, but then they change and their values don't line up with us, and we stop being friends. Sometimes that can be ugly. That's part of the freedom to disassociate with people. That doesn't mean that we should get together as a collective and have this sort of vision of the anointed of what the country should be, then evict people, deport people, just because they don't line up with what that particular group of anointed people think the country should look like.
I think what you're suggesting there is quite sort of this atomized society.
Quite the opposite.
Because obviously, what people don't quite fully grasp is that what's happened in the last sort of 70 or so years, or at least, the very least, post World War II, is unprecedented in this country's history. Because you can talk about, going back to Celtic times, you talk about our own invasion. You can talk about Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Franks, Frisians, whatever. You can talk about Vikings coming over here. You can talk about the Gallic invasion of Pictish Scotland, or even the Normans coming over, or the Dutch and Flemish traders coming over in the sort of 15th, 16th century, and so on. But people know deep down that it's disingenuous to make a comparison with that, to say, all these people coming over from West Africa or the Middle East or Southeast Asia and stuff like it is disingenuous. And what is going on at the moment in Europe is comparable to, say, that Yamnaya culture invasion of Europe at the end of the Neolithic period.
No, it's not. No. And
in terms of pure demographics, it is.
Forcing a homogeneity is more like an invasion where there's a genocide happening. The centers of the world that had free exchange of peoples and a free exchange of culture, that have given us some of the best things that have come out of European, Asian, African, and now American culture as well, have been, to do with the free exchange that we've been able to have as we've opened up to the world, and different continents have come together. We've actually been able to have more of a free exchange, and I really don't see how that's a bad thing. Surely, if you want a non-force element, then the way to go about that would be allowing people to freely exchange these things and for culture to grow. This has been happening for generations upon generations, and I don't see the meaningful difference between people from Europe exchanging cultural practices and people from Africa and Europe exchanging cultural practices.
Oh, yes, you do.
Other than no, I don't. Other than the fact that, as I said earlier, geographic location means that there are probably more cultural similarities. But then, as I've also said, within this world that's changed and technology has grown, with the internet and also with increased travel, those geographic boundaries aren't there anymore, and so it's much more analogous nowadays than maybe it would have been 500 years ago. Like, cultures were far more different then, but there is now being more cultural exchange between countries, and that's just a natural product of humans exchanging ideas and coming to better solutions with each other and working together.
Yeah, I mean, that is the globalized point of view, and I think race is the sort of last area we'll go into, so I won't my sort of response to you sort of more goes into that, unless ideologues you want to like move onwards, and we can sort of segue into that.
This is open to whatever you guys want to do. The topic is more of a suggestion.
I'm easy. We can segue if you really want.
Yeah, I'll basically say that. So I don't take a globalist view of humanity, and I view most people across different parts of the world as fundamentally rather different.
I mean, me too.
Many,
yeah, sure.
many people. I mean, certainly, in like Australasia and so on. These people often descend from entirely different forms of early human beings. You sort of got the Denisovan traits in large parts of Asia. You got the Neanderthal element of our DNA, which doesn't, perhaps, for example, exist within most Africans. So there are fundamental differences between people, and I sort of slightly anecdotal actually, but I remember watching a documentary. I think it was my mum or something, or it was at school. Anyway, it doesn't really matter too much. But I was watching a documentary about cannibals in Papua New Guinea, and everyone was horrified by it. They're going, "Oh, this is awful!" And why don't people stop? Why doesn't the UN go in and tell them not to cannibalize each other? And I said, "Well, who cares? Who cares that cannibalism occurs in that part of the world? It's of no consequence to us in this country. It's not part of our cultural practices at all.
But we can still say that it's wrong.
Different parts of the world, but I don't view that as like a universal morality thing, because they're not just obviously, but they cannibalize people. Don't just randomly. Well,
I thought we were all one body in Christ, and all the nations shall come together.
We've previously discussed my my sort of aversion to many Christian ethics. So I'm not universal.
You call yourself a Catholic, and they want to impress that upon people within your political ideology, yet you don't seem to hold to its ethics.
I'm largely a cultural Christian. For me, it's going to mass, it's the cathedrals, it's the choirs, etc., etc.
Yeah,
me too. But I'm not a. I don't believe in a universal morality. Obviously, killing people is wrong, but A, I don't care whether it occurs or not in other parts of the world, and B, there's an element to which, obviously, in the case of Papua New Guinea, to go back to the sort of case point, obviously they're not killing people just randomly and then eating them. They are, people they've killed in a sort of inter-village rivalry, and they are eating them in order to sort of gain their warrior powers. So it's not a completely pointless task. Obviously, I'm not advocating for cannibalism on your channel.
I mean, you're making it sound really cool.
But what I'm saying is that sort of obviously that's wrong to me in my part of the world, but I have no opinion other than pure fascination when it occurs in other parts of the world, because I just view them as like just completely separate. So it's
incredibly strange.
It's like going to the zoo and watching lizards do their own thing.
Dude, I find it really hard to engage with this because it's so far removed from from the natural instinct that I think humans generally have, but it's not universal, of course. That we do actually care about ethics as they apply to all humans, and we do actually care about other humans, and like, even if you want to say disgusting things like that, where you denigrate people to animals, I mean, people care about animals too, and
Of course they do. Of
and
course
it's
they do.
still
But
horrific
it's about how
for animals to
it's
be cannibals, you know.
well, it's about how local it is to you. Obviously, I care far more about homelessness in London, let's say, than I would do about a genocide in Syria, because that is an issue that is close to home. It's affecting people that are within my kin group. It's geographically local to me, and it's spiritually local to me. So even though it's less of a quote unquote humanitarian tragedy than this sort of said genocide in, let's say, Syria.
Okay, right. Right. Seeing as we're getting into the race memes, let's actually talk about it, because the issue that you're going to run into is how we actually define what these different racial groups are. Of course, we can acknowledge that there are different skin tones, for example. That's a very visible thing. There are, of course, different genetic traits that exist amongst humans. We're a diverse species, but the line between different humans is incredibly blurred, and I will be utterly shocked if you manage to provide a satisfying answer to it, and also to then subscribe or apply moral weight to one particular group or not. I find it incredibly strange as well, and you would need to provide an incredibly strong argument for me to even believe that that's something that's worthwhile talking about as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a purist on race, and I generally stick to a narrative largely defined by ethnicity. I think there are racial groups, and race is not a purely sort of social construct. Obviously many of the things we associate with race are social constructs.
You've essentially said that there are certain people within the world that, because they are vaguely descended from different people, possibly, therefore are not human or not worth the same. Not worth the same moral consideration that you would ascribe to humans. You said that it's like looking at animals in a zoo. I mean, surely you can see why I'm rather perturbed and wanting answers on that particular question.
Oh, of course. I mean, that is largely disgraceful to the modern mind to say. By using the word zoo, I mostly meant like an exhibitionist way of looking at it. It's for me, it's like it's a sense of geographic dislocation from an event occurring in relation to events that happen here. Obviously, in many ways, my first reaction when I see something is go, oh, that is awful.
Correct,
if a volcano erupted in Indonesia tomorrow, and sort of I saw plumes of lava going down into a village, it's like, oh, bloody hell. But in the grand scheme of things, I wouldn't be particularly keen on aid being sent or anything like that, just because I think there are issues here that I sort of care more about. And
you can make an isolationist argument without denigrating people to being subhuman, which is what you seem to do.
I don't believe people are subhuman. I don't necessarily view it as an issue of one racial group is better than another in a sort of. I mean, and personally, I think that perhaps it could be.
You subscribe moral weight to certain people based on
it could be the case in like say 2,000 years that Africa is the heart of Earth civilization.
And there are many civilizations,
and it will be. Well, what I mean is like they will be the sort of the leading and the focal point. They will be the Rome of their day. They'll be the New York of their day, and so on. So it's not a case of I don't deny their ability to do that, but I do acknowledge that they are more or less utterly separate from me.
Okay. In that case, can you please explain to me what your race is and how you define it? Who would be in the in-group of your race as opposed to other races?
I think you can largely go with so British Isles, Northwestern Europe. You've got obviously the Neolithic peoples that were here beforehand, and then you have the Indo-European people that arrived, and it's that sort of mixture in a way. So as I said earlier, I'm not a purist about it. I don't sort of literally go, I'm a sort of white, European. I don't, and that means that any kind of I'm fully.
Again,
I fully accept that there are people in places like Spain and Sicily and so on who will have plenty of ethnic pollination with places like Africa, and I don't necessarily. That doesn't really perturb me in many ways, but I think. Ethnicity is more important to me than race, to be entirely fair.
Yes. So the issue that you have is there are many issues. One, I don't think you've adequately defined race whatsoever there. But two, on this sort of ethnicity versus race thing, like there are certain people that would probably share fewer genes with you in Britain that would be far more culturally similar to you than someone possibly like in America who was far removed or at least partially removed culturally, but might share a few more genes with you. Surely you can acknowledge that and then say that, well, maybe we shouldn't be thinking in terms of these actual groups like them, us kind of thing, and more about the various individuals and how they fit within our culture.
Yeah, so that is an interesting point. America obviously did have a lot of immigration from our part of the world, and particularly the sort of 13 colonies, largely a sort of British venture in many ways. And America's quite a strange one because it is this sort of blend of all these sort of various like European colonists, plus you've got the added weight of the previous people living there, Native Americans and African American slaves who were brought over. So America's quite an odd one, but I would say that fundamentally that person with the closer genetic reading to myself is still not that I'm more in common with them, but they are still, let's say, quote unquote, English - American or Scots American or whatever.
So
and it's not like for me it's not a matter of someone who's come from, let's say, the West Indies, and they've come from Jamaica. Their dad was a sort of an RAF technician in the Second World War, moved over here. They might, and their family may have made a sort of very conscious effort to become British, and I won't necessarily deny them of that, but they're still obviously, I suppose Caribbean ethnicity is another quite challenging issue because they're taken from West Africa slaves. Sorry, Ideologues.
Now we are officially moving on to the race topic, so you can just continue what you were saying in your opening statement.
Grand, no worries. Okay, so I don't think, and I slightly sort of remove myself from many so nationalists, that it's not about necessarily, it's not about whether or not you are adhering to particular cultural norms necessarily. It's you either are English, i.e. you sort of come from a sort of Anglo-Saxon heritage, or you come from a sort of Celtic heritage, whether it's one of the Brittonic peoples that lived here before that.
Why does that define English? Why have you chosen that as the definition?
Because those are the people that have lived in England as the idea of England came into being.
Okay, but that's not actually all that accurate in terms of the way that our culture and identity has gone about. I mean, the original unification of England under the Anglo-Saxons was one thing, but then we had the Norman invasion, and that was to many more like an occupation of England. But to some, it was also the true England, and there was a big cultural divide. And then during the sort of 15th century, I'd say, there was more of an idea of a new type of English, which was more of a like blend of these cultures, especially when the language started to blend more and things like that. And I think you can see where I'm going with this, that actually
I do.
What it means to be English has changed lots over centuries.
Those
harking back to one particular point because you choose it is really, really, really silly. And what we should be doing is going the here and now. This is what England is.
Those cultural groups which you've pointed out have, even before they arrived in England, has coexisted in other parts of Europe previously before. It's not, it is, as I said earlier, like disingenuous to compare this sort of this emergence of quite similar cultures. The Celtic and Germanic, and the Normans were by and large Germanic, sort of Francophone Germans in a way, more Francophone Norse. These people were very similar. The Vikings, apart from their different religion when they first arrived, are more or less identical to the Anglo-Saxons. Certainly as a material culture. Certainly as a material culture, and in many ways ethnically as well. Came from many of them.
There was certain overlap, of course, but to say that they're like
often use this.
the same, it's all really wishy-washy.
But there's a scale. But there's a scale to it.
Sure, but then what's to say that there's a particularly Englishy person from the other side of the world that comes and integrates really, really well? Surely, by your own logic, if there's a scale, then they're more English than the least Englishy French person.
Well, do they? Because let's say an Indian. Let's say you have like an Indian family that moves here. Many of them will still speak Urdu or whatever when they are at home. They will still.
Them, yeah. But they also speak English as well.
Okay, but they still retain their own cultural heritage.
Good for them.
Well, yeah, no, and I agree with you. I agree they should do that, and I would view them as odd if they didn't. But I just don't believe that.
And many others shed them, Many others prefer English culture and ingratiate themselves with it, and that's fine too.
But I think it's odd. I have a suspicion of people who are willing to abandon, or at least partially abandon, their own cultural heritage that's tied to their ancestry in favour of something else. I could never go and live in Japan.
I don't personally want to abandon my cultural heritage.
No, so it's I just view it as particularly odd, and therefore I don't trust it. If someone says, they integrate, I go, well, they don't really integrate, do they? And even if they have integrated, most of them don't.
They do.
They have integrated, then why would I want someone who so readily abandoned everything about their all their ancestors before them, and they said, none of that matters anymore. I'm going to go to this completely different part of the world and take up their cultural more with us.
Surely
why?
Be
why? Why do they fit in more with us?
Because people are different.
But what I mean is,
people are individuals. They have different wants, needs, desires.
People are individuals. Beliefs. But what makes that person think, I'm going to completely abandon everything behind me?
Because they fit in more with us. They prefer to be here and be part of our culture, which is fine. That's good. People should be part of the culture that they identify with the most.
But I simply view that as a betrayal of their own past.
Okay, well you can. They don't.
So natural.
They're just living their life, And why should we stop them? Just because you don't like it? It's not silly. It's
not just an issue of I don't like it. It's how we're going to put ourselves as our own society. And many people in this country are concerned about what they view as Britain being warped over time. Many people don't wish to say it out in public because they don't want the
of course,
trouble of saying it. But people are concerned, and when you get large communities of people who move, then you get white flight from those areas, and they feel abandoned by their government. They feel as though these large.
Again, when I was explicitly talking about.
When did I mention skin color?
White flight.
Right. But
that's light-skinned people moving from one area to another.
Well, yeah, but it's when I refer to white flight,
people can be dark-skinned
and
have a sort of Anglo-Saxon culture, and people can be light-skinned and have for example, an Indian or an African culture.
No, they don't.
They absolutely can. They absolutely can.
I know very few. I know.
If they fit into that culture, it doesn't matter how few. The point is that we should be accommodating everyone, because if we want the best society, then we should be allowing people to fit into the culture that is most natural to them.
But why would it be natural to assimilate into a culture that's like thousands of miles away from you? It's not like there's nothing natural about that. It's not nothing natural about that at all.
Not every single part of one racial group fits in perfectly with that culture. Some individuals will fit more in with another culture, and that's fine. Let them do that. We should be following what is natural to us.
But it's not natural at all, because that only exists
Absolutely
because
natural. If
it's not
I
natural at all,
want,
because
if I want to go to church,
exists because people are.
that's what I feel naturally at home, then I should be able to do that. If someone else doesn't, then why should I force them? The whole point is we should allow people to naturally follow what their own identity is, what their own desires are. That's surely the way that we should be having society, in that natural fashion.
It's not natural at all. Going back to the other issue of
If you apply no force,
know,
then it's natural, surely. If you allow them to naturally go about their business, that's natural. Otherwise, you're just imagining what should be natural and then forcing it upon them. Do you see the utter hypocrisy here?
not at all, because they are only aware that they, in this particular example, like, let's say, English culture, even though they're brought up in, let's say, like West Africa, because the internet exists and they're able to look up a YouTube video or something, or hear about it. They don't. It's absurd. It's absurd that someone just randomly decides.
But it happens, so you can't deny nature.
But I'm not denying nature at all. It's nothing. There's nothing.
But if you're saying that it's absurd that they're naturally choosing that, and you want to force something,
they're not naturally choosing it, because it's
Who's forcing
the modern world is an aberration of nature. It's the sort of skyscrapers.
It kind of sounds like maybe you guys should get into the definition of natural, just so before we move forward.
Probably fair. For me, natural kind of is sort of organic emergence from a people in relation to their natural world. In many ways, to what extent it mirrors the natural world in many sense, and has the least is the least impacted by technological influences.
And I go along similar lines. It is what spontaneously emerges in human behavior without the use of force.
But I think where the sort of the issue here is this idea of like spontaneity. People just randomly decide to sort of
random.
Well, it is random. Well,
not random.
The spontaneity is
they personally vibe with tea and crumpets more than curry or something, and that's fine. Good on them. They can also like curry.
Okay,
I could also like curry.
Plenty of people in this country don't, might not want that person here in the first place, and many of them. So, to what extent do we have the right to say no? You can't do that as a collective.
Well, of course, every country has the right to democratically decide how we go about our immigration policy, and most people are okay with not unlimited immigration, but to have immigration from all over the world. Most people are in favour of some sort of selection process, and I think that's fair, because we can't take on an unlimited stream of people just for infrastructure purposes, but we can take on people to fill certain job roles for society. We can also take upon people who follow a certain set of selected criteria, if we so wish, and that's what we do. And I don't see how that's an issue. Maybe you can argue that that if our public services are under stress, we could limit the numbers or something. But
the present system is more or less entirely opposed. There was never any democratic mandate for the level of migration that has occurred. If you'd given them a looking glass, i.e. the people of the time, and showed them, I don't know, say Luton or Croydon or Peckham or something, they would be absolutely horrified, because what they thought were a few sort of helpers out from the empire to come and help to rebuild Britain has turned into large scale, well, in many ways, colonization of their own society. Sort of
how is it colonization if they're part of us? If they are English,
they're not part of us. They're not English. You cannot become English.
Of course you can.
You can't become it. There's nothing you can do to become English. There's nothing you can do to become Nigerian. There's nothing you can do to become
you can be
Mongolian.
absolutely more in line with English cultural values and identity than someone who is, more genetically linked. We've gone through that already.
But I don't believe that but that's not a
So why
mark
don't
of
we
it.
define what's English by who fits in best with our culture, who basically who wants to associate with us and ingratiate themselves with what it means to be English. Surely that should define Englishness, not some aesthetic thing. Like you go to a town and you're like, oh my god, look at all these dark-skinned people. Come on, that's literally just like, oh my god, I've walked into a room and there's blue wallpaper. How awful! Come on, it should be about actual meaningful things rather than just.
It is meaningful things. It is meaningful things. And race and genetics and stuff are meaningful things in many ways. It's about your sort of kin group. You think about most medieval villages were for the most part an extended family or extended kin group, not in a sort of literal cousin way, but they were sort of mostly second and third generation cousins.
And the various communities that I've been part of have been like second families to me. Yeah, like when I've been part of theatrical societies or part of my church, for example, but none of them had any policy regarding race. None of them said, oh, we can only have people with certain genetic qualities and others can't be part of it. No, it had nothing to do with it. It was all to do with the free association of people around a particular idea. And that is what builds communities. Those are the strongest bonds.
Well, the communities are built on the extended kin group in an organic sense. And you can obviously...
It's factually untrue, though.
It's not factually untrue at all. That was more or less the situation in large parts
with people that are outside their quote-unquote kin group. How come they are freely choosing this? You're going against nature here. Just because they
freely choose it, but they, a lot of scientific studies do show in many cases that people, will have like an in-group preference. But I mean, ironically, one of the things that came out of the Black Lives Matter issue last summer, and there's sort of all these sort of like left-wing journals and stuff screaming about white people have sort of in-group preferences and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's just obviously that is natural. So of course people sort of favour those who are
with the fact that they essentialise it to all white people. I think that's really, really dumb. But certainly, yeah, some people have in-group preferences, yeah, and those can be based on anything. I think in-group preferences make sense. Like I had an in-group preference, people part of my church. That's fine.
Yeah.
That makes sense. But in-group preference based on skin color, like come on, grow up. Like think of something more meaningful.
Well, it's more than just skin color, isn't it? It's more than just skin color. I mean, I could go to the south of France and get a tan, and I would look very different from like a very pale Scotsman. But it's more than just skin color
that causes certain pigments in your skin. It's meaningless stuff when actually we should be assessing people on their merits.
It's not meaningless because actually, people, if you look at race, like it is more than just someone's skin color. There are sort of different sort of skull shapes.
Sure. Well, yes. Yeah, okay. So another aesthetic thing. You care more about
different,
and
like certain racial groups of
things, like the merit of someone's character. Surely that's how to build a healthy society. I don't want to associate myself with people that look vaguely like me but are like really degenerate. Let's say I want to associate with people who actually have good moral character and who I get on well with, and we have cultural practices that we share.
No, of course.
That's what communities are built upon.
But in most of those cases, those cultural practices emerge. Most of those cultural practices emerge from a sort of single focal point. Sort of a culture largely emerges from an ethnicity, and that ethnicity is experienced with its natural world around it.
Only due to the lack of travel. If back before we had really efficient means of travel, it would just be a coincidence that the people near you happen to be more closely genetically linked to you because people couldn't move that far. So you had to marry your cousin down the road, That's just how it was. But now we have the means to spread more, and that's fine. Times have changed.
Well, they have changed, and I'll put my cards on the table that I deeply regret the industrialization of the world, partly for this sort of reason.
But
Um,
look at us having a fantastically meaningful debate right now over the internet. You know,
Yeah.
what an absolute treasure of our modern society.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, there are sort of ups and downs to it, and I do enjoy being able to communicate with people across the world. I enjoy being able to, watch videos and, all the things. But I would happily trade it all in for, a small village community in the sort of Highlands of Scotland or whatever,
That sounds lovely, and I really hope you get
and
that.
have a small, and have a small sort of butchers, and not have to, worry about, Amazon, out competing a small,
Agreed. Yeah. Like I am very much on the same page when it comes to um, big big corporations and things like that. I really want small businesses to flourish and stuff, but that's all about allowing any individual to have the means and freedom to be able to pursue their own economic activity and have a more meaningful connection to the place that they live, and that's cool. I don't know why you need to bring in like weird like genetic markers and stuff into it. It's just
because the
also
movement of those, because one of the issue here is the movement of such large numbers of people to make the issue of race problematic is a problem in and of itself, which has emerged from that society. Why has it happened? Who is responsible for it? Why do people come here?
People want to move, and then the government let them in. That's what happened. I mean,
Yeah.
you can argue about maybe having less immigration to halt the speed of cultural change. I'd probably disagree that that's necessary, but if you want to make that, sure, but that's nothing to do with race either. Surely you should be judging your immigration system, if you have to limit it for whatever reason. Surely it should be based on the merits of the people that you will be taking in or not.
Well, then on top of that, I mean, let's say pre-Second World War, the levels of immigration into this country was almost totally minimal.
Mm-hmm.
Apart from, there's sort of a fair few Canadians would come back and forth, a fair few Americans come back and forth, and so on and so forth. But you weren't getting large movements of, say, West Africans into Britain, or particularly at sort of Bristol, London, and even actually, I mean, there was a few notable situations in 18th century and early 19th century London, where a large number of escaped slaves and black people who'd worked on navy ships were allowed to then sort of live in London for a bit. But actually, the people of London didn't like them there. They didn't like that they were there. They didn't.
All of the people of London?
Well, I don't know all the people of London.
I don't think you're old enough to like even know like much about that firsthand, let alone sort of make these broad statements.
Obviously not firsthand, but it was the historical consensus is that the people of London, whoever they might be and whoever they might be represented by, decided they didn't like
as the historical
living there.
The historical consensus is that all of London hated them.
No, the historical consensus is that enough people were disgruntled with them that the government at the time removed them from London and sent them back to Sierra Leone.
Yeah, but that's often a small minority group of people saying that they don't like something, and then the government using force to move people. That's kind of the exact things that we've just been arguing over. I'd say that you are in that vocal minority group who are kicking up a stink about things that don't really need to be kicked up a stink about.
I think there's every reason to kick up a stink about it. 2066 is the sort of deadline for white Britons. Well, I say white Britons being a minority in this country, not necessarily a minority like completely, but they'll have the smallest, like they'll no longer be the largest single share of the population, as opposed to like Nigerians or Poles or Indians or what,
so
or have you.
Like,
and at that point, this country will radically begin to change, and you see the kind of things that they can pull as their own groups particularly we see like Black Lives Matter over the summer, where
What are you basing this on? Like, you say it will change in 2066. Why? How? Like,
because
demonstrate
because
how you
because
actually
those
get
because
that link.
well because so these people have no particular loyalty to the idea of Britain. They have come here in most cases for a cushier lifestyle. Fair enough. I don't necessarily.
Immigrants.
Pardon, sorry, you cut out there.
These people meaning immigrants.
Yeah.
You think
or
that,
at least,
that
or at
that
least the
have no agency?
immigrant descended population.
Certainly, there are some immigrants that are pretty apathetic to our country, and that's a shame. But there are loads of immigrants that love our country and want to be part of it and are part of it.
Well, they love it because it's a sort of fairly nice place to live.
And they love the culture. They love the people.
Not really.
Not
Most
really.
of them. Most
Have you
of
talked
them.
to an immigrant ever?
Yes, of course I have.
Okay, we'll talk to a few more because there are plenty of people that absolutely love our culture and not even love in like a fetishized way. They're just part of it, you know, the same way that you and I are.
Well,
They've just
I mean, some of them do, but it's
been here
not.
long enough.
In my experience, most of them don't.
Engage with it full-heartedly, and
in my experience, most of them don't. I went to a school in North. Sorry, I'll let you continue.
Many immigrants, in fact, go above and beyond people that are quote unquote native in terms of community engagement. I've also seen that. There's a whole spectrum of people here, and what I'm trying to plead you to do is to look at people on those merits rather than just make these broad generalizations based on what seems to be just a subconscious dislike of color, but maybe some deep-seated ideological thing. But I implore you not to just throw these sort of blanket things on people because it's not actually tempered to reality.
I went to a school in North London as a sort of primary school for a bit, and each year it became more and more, you know, quote unquote, you know, enriched basically. And you know, there's an element to it. I mean, I hate any kind of, you know, going into like victim mentality stuff, but there's an element to which you like sort of increasingly you felt more alienated in the playground because they would associate with their own kind of the playground. They wouldn't play football with, you know, the other sort of English children.
So why should we do it?
Pardon? Sorry.
All right, so
It
we
sucks.
are
Do it.
So maybe we're gonna wrap up the race topic and then go into final closing statements. So just
all right, okay.
Notice.
I'll let LeBron finish up his point, and I'll give a quick response.
Yeah. So let's not do that. You know.
But that's natural. Like, you know, like even children do that. You know, they know who their own kind is in the playground. They associate with them.
Children are way more race blind than adults are. This is just a fact. I'm sorry.
I can't agree with that. That's not my lived experience, and B, I think there are plenty of studies which have shown that.
I think the point is that just because you have racist beliefs doesn't mean that everyone does, and doesn't mean that it's natural. And if you really cared about what's natural, you would actually allow a framework in which you can let people freely associate with each other, and allow society to organically shun those that disparage cultural practices that we think are really great, but also take in people regardless of their racial background who actually do agree with our values, because that's why wouldn't we, essentially, other than, you know, you're different, you know.
But it's more than just, you know, you're different.
Well,
hang on. Well, so I'll sort of wrap up.
Maybe do closing statements. Yeah.
So wait, ideologues, is this wrapping up in the race statement, or is this wrapping up the entire?
Yeah, so this will be that. So finish up whatever you guys want to finish on this topic, then we'll move on to final closing statements.
All right, okay. I think I'll just finish on race. My view more on race is that it's not like a monolithic concrete thing, and there is, you know, there has been like historical cross-pollination, and it's a spectrum. I'll say that's the spectrum more or less manifests itself in the different sort of races, in the different ethnicities within like umbrella racial groups. You know, and I'm not a purist about it. You know, I acknowledge that, you know, for example, if I were to have my way, I would not be going after, you know, like mixed race people, because it's not their fault. But like race blindness, for example, is not in some ways it's sort of more inherent within children, because that doesn't mean that they're nasty. That doesn't mean that they're nasty to other children who are of different race to them, but they do know, they are able to see that some children look more like them, some children have a similar way of life to them, and it's not just a appearance thing. It's if you're in a playground, it's not just that they're black. It's that they have a different sense of humour to you. They don't have the same banter as your in group. There's obviously there's much more to this than just someone's appearance, which I think a lot of people try and sort of boil racism down to.
Okay, and then my closing thought about race is that essentially, I mean, just quickly on the child thing, I just implore people to go and just Google any study on like the racism within children. There'll be various different results, and you can make up your own mind. But as far as I can tell, a lot of racist ideas and like viewing people differently in terms of their race and making value judgments based on it seems to be a learned thing. Children seem to just get along with people that they are with. If they are in contact with people from different races, then they will view that as normal. That seems to be what the literature shows. Anyway, more broadly, the reason why I say that it's about these aesthetic things is because when I make the gambit to you that you should look at the merit of people's character and allow people to freely associate with people in a spontaneous way that allows cultural growth, if those are the things that you genuinely care about, then the only thing that's left surely is the meaningless stuff like aesthetics, if like the actual content of people's character is accounted for. That's why I make that point. And I don't think that you've I don't think that you've answered that satisfactorily. It's a hard word. Anyway.
All right, so moving into final closing statements, Mirswalder, you can go first.
Because all debate, I think fundamentally, I think there's a lot of issues on which there's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding. I'm a traditionalist. I view that I think things emerge organically within societies. Obviously, history is far more complicated than just that. Obviously, history is multi-causal. History is complicated. You have cross-pollination between different empires, civilizations. It's not a concrete thing, and I would never, be sort of naive enough to say that the idea of being British, for example, which is to be entirely fair, a construction, has a sort of this clean-shaven line down which separates it from being Norwegian or being Dutch or being French. But there's a spectrum. I believe fundamentally that time does move on. I don't believe that it moves on in a linear way. I believe it sort of cycles around, but nonetheless, time does move on. And I don't necessarily suggest we sort of live in an agricultural society or whatever, but that you apply the gathered knowledge of your ancestors and you sort of move forward, not dismantling your past in favor of a sort of uncertain future, basically.
All right, so
oh, sorry.
Oh, I thought you were done there, sir.
No, yeah, I'll finish there.
Okay, and Liberaven, your closing statement.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting conversation. I expected to be talking more about Catholic stuff because that seems to be more what the integralist stuff's about. Whereas this seems to be just more sort of mainstream ethno-nationalist arguments and possibly fascist and stuff. So, but essentially, I think the issue that I'm seeing is a deep-seated fetishization of certain aspects that you associate with our culture. And I can understand plenty of the ideas of nostalgia about things and wanting people to get along within society and wanting community and all these things. And also wanting a natural order of things, that a culture that is born from nature rather than distorted by people who think they know better. But then what I'm getting is a hypocrisy in the argument, in that it seems as if I'm being told that in order to have this natural thing, we should then impose a certain idea, a sort of anointed vision of what society should be, of what our culture is, and one that is based on what seems to be just very arbitrary notions of differences between humans. When I would say that our society should have certain limits to it, of course, and people should have certain things that are illegal against them. And if we are to limit immigration, we should have certain ways in which we select for people. But these should all be based on merit rather than sort of these, nonsense notions of genetic markers. If it correlates with genes, then so be it. What it should be is about the actual merit of the person, and in general, if you want that natural way of going about things, be it religion or culture or race, you should allow people to have a framework in which they can freely choose the lives that they want to lead, and you will see people actually emerge with fulfilling communities and having a great life, and that's what any society should actually be about.
All right, so thank you both for coming on. You can find Mirswalda online with the username Mirswalda on YouTube and Liberaven with the name Liberaven on YouTube. If you search Ideologues Integralist or Ideologues Liberal, there are two interviews on my channel will come up. So thank you both for coming on. And I'll see you all on the chat next week. Goodbye.
Thank you.